السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we took a break last week, right? الله يخليك يا شيخ. Hopefully inshallah was beneficial last week. طب الحمد لله. جزاكم الله خير. So we're picking off where we left last time in the story of Musa عليه السلام. Do you guys remember where we left off? وقال يا موسى اجعل لنا آلهة, right? So this is where we stopped at after the Prophet Musa عليه السلام with Bani Israel had escaped to the other side of Sinai, right? In the peninsula. And one of the first things they had asked Musa عليه السلام when they encountered another tribe or a group of people was that Musa عليه السلام would give them or create for them a deity similar to how they were seeing people worshiping idols. And we went through the entire conversation, right? Today we're going to take another section, but this one is more of when Musa alayhi salam left his people, right? When he left his people to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Turi Sina, and the events that happened afterwards, right? Now, one thing we should pay attention to is that when Bani Israel were in Egypt, as they say, there is no tashri'ah. Tashri'ah, there was no legislation, right, that was given to Bani Israel, because they had no control, they had no rule, they had no entity of their own to be able to establish legislations. Does it make sense? This is very similar to what happened to the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, when the Muslims were oppressed, there wasn't much legislation, right? There was heavy focus on aspects of creed, right? The basics, the pillars of things. We're talking about the fundamentals of manners, for example, right? The fundamentals of tawheed, of belief in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the existence of the hereafter and the evidence associated with it. There was no legislation, right? Legislations only happened mostly, the majority, obviously, it doesn't mean that there was no completely. There was a few legislations here and there, but it wasn't until the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had migrated to Medina and the Muslims had a place of their own, they were ruling themselves, when now legislations were necessary, right? How to interact as a society among one another, the rights of the Muslim brother to Muslim brother, the neighbors, and so forth, the definite legislations of acts of worship that you can now openly perform, right? The 5 daily prayers in Jama'ah, even though the 5 daily prayers were revealed in Mecca, but it wasn't revealed in the way it is right now. In Mecca, when it was first revealed, it was 2 rak'ahs, right? It wasn't then completely in its full form as it is now today until the Prophet ﷺ had moved to Medina after establishing the masjid and rules of praying in jama'ah and all these other different rules, including fasting and zakah and battle on the battlefield, what you're supposed to do. All these legislations did not come until later on. Similarly with Bani Israel, when they were in Egypt under the rule of Fir'aun, it was impossible for them to have any sort of legislations. The main ideas were just mainly to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and escape with Bani Israel. That was it, right? Yes?
We know that Musa alayhi salam was not the first Rasul that was sent to Bani Israel. So how come there was no legislation? They had prophecy.
So whatever the legislation was there was not necessarily meant to last. You have to remember that, right? By the time they got there, there was no legislation that is new. So Musa alayhi salam is a messenger, and so he comes with his own legislation. It was not revealed, right? The only time it was revealed, and this is where we're getting to, is after they had crossed Sinai, and now they are free to rule themselves, which means now they need legislations. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent for Musa alayhi salam, right, to go to At-Tur al-Ayman, right? At-Tur, which is the mountain, and it still exists, that area still exists until now in Sinai. I think it's more of a touristic area now, if I'm not mistaken, right? I think there's a hotel that's called Tur Sinai, which is kind of interesting. but that place still exists until now, and people go visit it. But once this was only the time where, after then when legislations were going to be established, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made an appointment and ordered Musa alayhi salam to head in a specific area so that he would give him those legislations. And this one when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed the Torah to Musa alayhi salam and the alwah, the scripts to Musa alayhi salam, and so forth, with all the legislations that are necessary for Bani Israel. Now what's interesting is as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَإِذْ وَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 40 لَيْلَةً, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِذْ وَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 40 لَيْلَةً ثُمَّ اتَّخَذْتُمُ الْعِجْلَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. So I wanna pause a little bit at this verse because it's kind of very interesting. Of course, all the verses of the Quran are interesting, right? But particularly for our story, the behavior of Bani Israel was interesting. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and remember when we had appointed with Musa, remember when we had made an appointment with Musa for 40 nights. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ثُمَّ اتَّخَذْتُمْ الْعِجْلَ مِنْ بَعْدِهِ وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. Then you took, you're talking to Bani Israel, you took me for worship, the calf after him. After who? After Musa, meaning after he had departed, while you were wrongdoers. وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. And so, what this verse is pointing to is that Musa alayhi salam, when he went to the appointed place where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructed him to go, so that he would take that revelation, the minute he left, what happened? They went back to kufr, right? They went back to disbelief, right? Bani Israel, remember previously they said, اجعل لنا إلها كما لهم آلهة. Right before that they said, give us a deity or a God to worship similar to they have a God to worship. They want something that is physical. The minute that he left, this is what happened. And the reason being is because Musa alayhi salam, they had some reverence and fear of Musa alayhi salam. Right? Bani Israel had some sort of fear of Musa alayhi salam because the reverence they had to him, the personality that Musa alayhi salam had. He was a very commanding, charismatic prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And so they would not do anything wrong in his presence. But the minute he left, this is when something happens. Right? And subhanAllah, a lot of times this is human behavior so human beings tend to regulate themselves in one of two ways. Either there's an internal regulation or a external regulation. What is more important is what? The internal regulation. Because in the absence of the external regulation, and the absence where no one else is seeing you, you self-regulate. It's the aspect of taqwa, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what matters the most. But in a society that has no internal regulation, no fear, no moral compass, like the one we live here, what really commands this society is what? External regulation, right? The minute that is gone, what happens? Or the minute they can get away with things, what happens? Riots, right? Essentially, right? Whatever you can get your hand, you can get on. People don't steal mostly not because they think it's wrong, but they're afraid of getting caught, right? Whatever the case is, right? They're afraid of getting caught. But this tells you that there's something wrong over here, right? As Muslims, we understand, this is why, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, every Friday will order us with taqwa, right? Is that internal, as Muslims, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watchful of us, that He sees what we do, knowing that we're going to be held accountable on the Day of Judgment, that is a very powerful internal regulator, right? This is something that we as Muslims, we understand, and it's very important, and that's why we need to nurture this. Bani Israel didn't seem to have that. They feared Musa alayhi salam, and so the minute he left, and he left him with Harun, they took the opportunity, and they weren't afraid of Harun, the brother of Musa alayhi salam, similar to how they feared him. And so what did they do? They ignored him, and they worshipped the calf. And even when Musa alayhi salam had asked his brother what happened, he said, "Inna al-qawma istad'afuni." Right? The people, right? Indeed, the people had oppressed me. They saw that they took me as a person who was weak, that couldn't do, didn't have that strength, and so they oppressed me, and they did whatever they wanted. And so Musa's there, they're afraid. Musa's gone, they do whatever they want. Okay, they went back to worshipping the idols. طيب. And as the wording to say, وإذ وعدنا موسى 40 ليلة ثم اتخذتم العجل من بعده, right? Min over here in the Arabic language they say the beginning, right? When did they start? So they start immediately, pretty much after he left, and he didn't leave for too long. How long did he leave for? Well, 40 nights there, but we'll give a leeway of a few days walking back and a few days walking forward, 50 days, right? A month and a half. 2 months. Is that a long period for people to change their belief system? Isn't that kind of strange? Right? That's very odd, right? It's very interesting. It's a very interesting phenomenon. طيب. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he told them, اتخذتم العجل من بعده, he said, وَأَنْتُمْ ظَالِمُونَ. Right? While you are wrongdoers, which means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling them, you had no excuse for what you did. What you did was completely wrong. There is no excuse for this. It's not like you don't know that, you don't know what Tawheed is. It's not like, Musa عليه السلام did not instruct you. It's not like nobody else warned you. Nonetheless, so there was absolutely no excuse, right? And so they had absolutely no reason for the actions they did. And whoever reads these different passages, subhanAllah, when you read the different passages of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treated Bani Israel after every transgression, you realize how merciful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was towards them and how much forbearance Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had with them. He didn't punish them immediately, because the following ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ثُمَّ عَفَوْنَا عَنْكُم مِّن بَعْدِ ذَلِكَ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَشْكُرُونَ. So after you did this, right, after you worshipped the calf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, then we forgave you, right, after that, so that perhaps you would be grateful, right? Now, لَعَلَّكُمْ over here, لَعَلَّ can mean different things. It means perhaps, that you might. It's almost like it's not going to happen, but I'm hoping, right? It's almost if this happens, لَعَلَّكُمْ, maybe, perhaps. So I'm giving you a chance and another chance and a third chance. But of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what Bani Israel is going to do. Like in the second, another verse, right? In Surah Al-A'raf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَاتَّخَذَ قَوْمُ مُوسَى مِن بَعْدِهِ مِنْ حُلِيِّهِمْ عِجْلًا جَسَدًا لَهُ خُوَارٌ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse explains that calf, what was made of, what happened. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and the people of Musa, right? وَاتَّخَذَ قَوْمُ مُوسَى, and the people of Musa, what did they do? من بعده, after he had left, after his departure, from ornaments, من حليهم عجلة, from the ornaments they have, they created a calf, in the image of a calf that has a lowing sound. It has a sound that's being produced. In other verses of the Quran, it mentions that these, إِنَّ حُمِّلْنَا أَوْزَارًا مِنْ زِينَةِ الْقَوْمِ. So these ornaments, what they did was they had taken them from the Coptics. Right? And Musa had permitted that for them from the Coptics. And so what they did was they took that off, they melted it, and a Samiri who had followed Musa عليه السلام and had seen the traces of Jibreel in the sand, and he took part of that sand, and what he did was he threw it in that melting pot, and he created for them this calf that has almost like a way that allows wind to go through, and it produces that lowing sound, right? Low khuwar. Now what this indicates is how materialistic, how Bani Israel is very attached to the material world. And so once again, they gathered everything they had from gold and all these things, and they just created this. Now what's interesting, I want to point, so who did this? A Samiri. Right? It was under the instruction of a Samiri. What is interesting is that in the Torah, it mentions that it was Harun that did this. That was Harun that did this. But we all know that the Torah has been corrupted, right? It has been corrupted. And no way a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no way a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell people to commit shirk. It makes no sense, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this. ما كان للنبي أن يقول وما كان للنبي أن يؤتيه الله الكتاب والحكمة والنبوة ثم يقول الناس كونوا عبادا لي, right? It's not for a ما كان للنبي, it wasn't for a prophet that has been given the book and wisdom, right? And then he would tell the people, be servants to me or worship me. This is of course referring to Isa ibn Maryam, but it's a form of shirk. Any prophet would never do that, right? And so we know that definitely it was not Harun alayhi salam that did this, but it was a Samiri. And all the prophets, we know they are infallible, right? Infallible in delivering the message, let alone leading people astray. Because if a person claims to be a prophet and he provides evidence from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's Allah saying that this is my prophet. And Allah knows who He sends. He would never send a person who is corrupt, right? He wouldn't do that subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Samari is the one that did this. And he created that for them. And so they started worshipping that calf, right? قالوا هذا إلهكم وإله موسى فنسي, right? This is your God. They said this is your God. He told them this is your Lord. And I don't know how to describe, the level of intellect at that time when a person just decides, hey, I created something that must be God, right? How can you create a God? How can you fashion a God? Does a God need to be fashioned, right? It's exactly Umar al-Khattab, after he accepted Islam, he understood this. He realized how, subhanAllah, how stupid it seemed. He would say that while traveling, he would create the idol out of dates, right? So he'd worship him, and then when he gets hungry, he eats him, right? So how is that a God, right? Same thing, right? These were this thing was from nothing. You melted the gold and you created it and you worshipped him, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even Harun alayhi salam had pointed out to them, you claim this is a God, right? He said, أَلَمْ يَرَى أَنَّهُ لَا يُكَلِّمُهُم. Doesn't he see that this thing does not talk to them, right? Why are you worshipping? There's nothing coming from this thing that you created. Where are the teachings of this God? Because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if there is a creator, okay, there has to be instructions coming from that creator to tell you how to live your life, to tell you what He wants from you, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's nobody that creates something and just lets it be as it is. It doesn't work that way, right? This is why, for example, agnostics, people who are agnostic, it's not logical, right? People who are agnostics, they're different than atheists. Atheists don't believe in the existence of a higher entity. Agnostics believe in a higher entity, but that's it. This higher entity does not interfere, right? He put things in motion and just lets things ride, okay? That makes no sense. Anybody who's intelligent does that. And this verse kind of points nicely to that. So the minute we say that this is a God, then a condition has to do with this. Where is the teachings, right? Do the Bani Israel don't notice that there is no teachings, right? How does this God or calf want them to worship him? What does he like, right? So this doesn't he speak to them? That's the instructions aspect of it. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He focuses on the transgression aspect, right? You're wrongdoers. So this is something that's an error, right? So once again, there is no excuse for this. Now I'm going to go back to Musa عليه السلام, right? In another verse, we said, وَوَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 40 لَيْلَةً. In another verse in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَوَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 30 لَيْلَةً. Right? We had made an appointment with Musa, right? For how long? For 30 nights. But he says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا بِعَشْرٍ فَتَمَّ مِيقَاتُ رَبِّكَ 40 لَيْلَةً وَقَالَ مُوسَى لِأَخِيهِ هَارُونَ اخْلُفْنِي فِي قَوْمِي وَأَصْلِحْ وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ سَبِيلَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Right? So Musa alayhi salam, when he was, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised him 30 nights, and then he added another 10, right? And by that, there's completion of 40 nights. And Musa alayhi salam, before he leaves, he told his brother, "Ukhlufni fi qawmi," right? Take my place among my people. وَأَصْلِحْ, and do right. وَلَا تَتَّبِعْ سَبِيلَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ, do right by them and do not follow the way of the corruptors. So there's some lessons we can try to point out over here as we're going through this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, did he say 40 يوما or 40 ليلة? Layla means night, right? Yawm, which means day, morning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made an appointment with Musa. Did he say 40 layla or 40 yawman? Layla, right? In the evening. Why the evening? Like, do you make appointments with people in the evening or do you make it in the day? In the day, right? So what's the significance over here of why specifying night? The Tahajjud prayer. I like that one. It is true, right? It is, a lot of that is true. What happened was that Musa alayhi salam was in seclusion in worship at night alone with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like when you're by yourself and you're speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in prayers, you're in seclusion with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Musa alayhi salam spent the first 30 nights in ta'abbud, right? In nightly worship. That is akin and very similar to what the Prophet ﷺ did in Ghar Hira before he received revelation. Right? In Ghar Hira, towards the end before the revelation, he would always, as mentioned, Dawat al-Layali, at nights he would stay there at night, and he'd worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whoever comes to the day, he would host him and so forth. But it was mainly the night that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would leave everybody and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah, but I'm pointing to over here, this is something that's important, is because Musa alayhi salam, right, essentially was going through a period of preparation, like first 30 days and then the following 10 days. It's a period of preparing yourself for something that is significant, something that's important. And the strength that you need comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the best time to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, and where the multiple blessings come down is in the night, right, where everybody else is asleep and it's just you. There's no busy time, like you're not busy during the day. There's nobody requesting things from you. You alone and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, in tahajjud. This is why, for example, I'm going to relate this to the other hadith that we know from the Prophet ﷺ, where the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala descends in the last third of the night, and he asks, "Hal min sa'ilin?" Right? Is there a person who asks something that they desire? Right? Is there any person who wants a dua to be accepted? Is there anybody who needs a need? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking the slaves, and it's the one that takes opportunity of that time that reaps the most. And so if we're ever, remember Musa alayhi salam was going there to receive something that's meant to change things, that's legislation. Which means if we ever want to make sure that we're ready to have the ability to bear the burden and shoulder the difficulty that is required for us to progress further, one of the most important things is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and prepare yourself for it spiritually. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam what? Ya ayyuhal muzammil, qum al-layla illa qalila, nisfahu aw unqus minhu qalila, aw zid alayh, wa rattil al-Qur'ana tartila. Right? Why? Inna sanulqi alayka qawlan thaqila. Inna nashi'ata al-layli hiya ashaddu wat'an wa aqwa muqila. And so the rough meaning of those verses, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ya ayyuhal muzammil, the one who's covered, qum al-layl. He's telling him, stand up in prayer in night. For how long? Nisfahu, right? أو انقص منه قليلا, or reduce from a half, or increase more than that, right? أو زد عليه قليلا, right? Why? Because إنا سنلقي عليك قولا ثقيلا. We are gonna bring down to you a heavy, right? قولا ثقيلا, essentially the Quran, the revelation, the orders that you're supposed to bear, right? And so this is the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet ﷺ how to prepare himself. Similarly, Musa alayhi salam was going through that period of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ordered him, come meet me, worship, right? Because you are preparing yourself to all these things, right? And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him the first 30 nights and then he increased him another 10, this was from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? This when we do good things, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so essentially Musa was having that relation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then Allah rewarded him by giving him an extra 10 nights. Al-hasana ta'ti bil-hasana, right? The hasana, the good deed, brings another Good deed. This is what happens. Like you do one good deed, it will drag with it another good deed, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards us this way. When we do something that is an act of worship that brings us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah rewards us by facilitating for us something else that we can do to get closer to Him. It makes it easier for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it easier for us, makes us want to do it even more. Right? And so this is why it becomes a lot easier for those who are righteous, for example, who continuously good deeds. You find that for them, doing good deeds is very simple and easy. Now, the opposite is also true. السيئة تأتي بالسيئة. Right? The bad deed will drag another bad deed along with it. Because the minute we commit a sin, we just stepped away from, we put ourselves further away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Our hearts become more close. It should not make any sense. It's an action. Right? Why is it very difficult? Why are we dragging our feet? Why do we find, why do we get very tired of it? You know, Uthman ibn Affan, he said something interesting. He said, لو صلحت قلوبنا ما مللنا من القرآن. Right? If our hearts were sound, we would never get bored of the Quran. It's true. Right? And so over here we see this, one thing over here, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewarded Musa alayhi salam because of that act of worship. That He gave him more. And so when we do acts of worship and get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah protects us. Right? And He empowers us and gives us the ability to move even further closer to Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Hadith Qudsi, He said, من تقرب إلي شبرا تقربت إليه ذراعا. Whomever comes closer to me with a hand span, I'll come closer to him with a arm length. Right? It's that reciprocation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's the aid and support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to us. طيب. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is essentially from this is telling us you start and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward. Right? You start and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward. And Allah's reward is even more than what we put. We put in little and the reward is immense. That's from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. The other thing I'm going to build on, I just put in that second point, but I'm going to go back to that first point of the importance of taking advantage, right, of the nighttime, right, so that we would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for His blessings and His bounties. If we really want change, right, we need to start going to this, right, doing more of the nightly prayers. And it doesn't have to be a lot. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, right, Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, he was inspecting the camp, right, before he wanted to go into Bayt al-Maqdis. And what he saw was the guards or the soldiers doing Qiyam al-Layl. And he said, this is how we become victorious. That's what it is, right? When it doesn't have to be every single person, but it's more of the majority of the ummah. Once the majority of the ummah have a certain characteristic, this is what it is, right? We can describe the ummah like that. Right? If the majority of the ummah are righteous, then we're a righteous ummah. If the majority of the ummah are not, then we got a lot to work on. Right? There's always exceptions. Without a doubt, there will always be exceptions, by the way. Right? There's always those individuals who will be in the higher upper ranks of righteousness. They will always exist until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the last breath of the believer. But what matters is how we are all collectively doing, right? The support of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is based on the collective. Wallahu a'lam. Of course, there are certain circumstances, but if we want to change things, we collectively, once again, have to do this, right? And it can start with one of the most important things is Qiyam al-Layl. And then once again, it doesn't have to be very much. All it requires is to get up maybe 10, 15 minutes before Fajr, if you want to do Qiyam al-Layl, right? Or pray a couple of rak'ahs before you go to sleep. Or do it after Isha, right? That is still Qiyam al-Layl. Of course, there's more better times than others. Of course, Nasr al-Night is better than others. But if we're unable to do it, don't limit yourself. Do whatever you can, but at least don't lose that share of that Qiyam al-Layl. And they tell you usually the night is the time where you meet with the one that you love, because there's nobody else around you, right? And so those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is when they meet with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. طيب. Now the third thing we can reflect on is more of any individual who who desires change, right? And especially those who are like in the path of like Islamic work, they have to prepare themselves to be able to succeed. Like Musa alayhi salam went through a preparation period. The Prophet ﷺ, before revelation, there was a preparation period. So similarly, anybody who wants to succeed in anything as Muslims, we need to make sure that we go through the preparation period, like prepare ourselves, right? No one can run a marathon without practicing, right? And for those who do all the way to the end, regret it the next morning, right? Probably for like next month, the body ache that they have and so forth, but they're not prepared for it. And now I'm saying this just to give you a kind of like, Ramadan, for example. If we want to take advantage of Ramadan, we need to prepare ourselves for it. So any sort of change, right, requires us that we prepare for it. And this is one of the lessons we can learn from that. Remember when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet sallam, right, إِنَّ سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا إِنَّ نَاشِئَةَ اللَّيْلِ هِيَ أَشَدُّ وَطْئًا وَأَقْوَمُ قِيلًا. Right? We are going to bestow upon you a heavy قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا, heavy statements. That's the Quran, legislations, the orders. إِنَّ نَاشِئَةَ اللَّيْلِ, in the middle of the night, أَشَدُّ وَطْئًا, there's more strength in it. وَأَقْوَمُ قِيلًا, and more straight up in terms of statement and truthfulness. And as human beings, as Muslims, we will, living in a society, there's a lot of burden associated with it when we want to live our life in the most righteous way possible. It is difficult. It's not that easy, right? Mingling with people is hard, right? Going through your life and mingling, interacting with people is difficult. Why? Because there's always negativity sometimes, wrong things that happen to you. Whatever the case is, it requires us to be prepared for that. That's why the Prophet ﷺ, for example, he said, مَنْ خَالَقَ النَّاسَ وَصَبَرَ عَلَى أَذَاهُمْ خَيْرٌ مِمَّنْ اعْتَزَلَ النَّاسَ وَلَمْ يَصْبِرْ عَلَى أَذَاهُمْ. The one who interacts with people and mixes with them is patient with their harm, is better than the one that isolates himself, right? That leaves them and is impatient with their harm. It's normal, it's expected when you interact with people, you get harmed. You're harmed by them, right? Whether because, inconsideration or some sort of oppression or lack of, manners and behaviors and etiquettes or whatever the case is. But as Muslims, in the society that we live in, that is even more multiplied, right? Because trying to live a way of righteousness, the proper way, we will face that difficulty. And so we need to prepare ourselves to be able to carry through that, right? To be able to stand and say, no, this is wrong, I cannot do this, or I have to do this, right? To be able to go to our bosses, for example, and say, listen, I gotta, on Friday, I gotta do this. I need actually a few minutes, at my lunchtime. Can you provide a place for me to pray? If not, can I pray in this spot? That requires courage, right? And it requires also the patience to sometimes even withstand some of the mocking you might hear. Because people, they're human beings. You might get mocked, right? Made fun of. It shouldn't deter us away. We're on a path that we know is correct. We need the ability to be, we need the strength to be able to go through that. Wallahu a'lam. طيب. The other thing I'm going to mention over here, Musa alayhi salam, who did he go meet? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Now, can you imagine the excitement of Musa alayhi salam? So you can actually sense that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Musa alayhi salam, وَمَا أَعْجَلَكَ عَنْ قَوْمِكَ يَا Musa, right? Why did you hasten and leave your people? He said, what? عَجِلْتُ إِلَيْكَ رَبِّي لِتَرْضَى. I hasten to you, my Lord, so that you be pleased. Like this was the feeling of Musa alayhi salam, right? The excitement of Musa alayhi salam, desiring to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this, wallah, it's a beautiful sense. Like we should always have the same methodology. When we're going to pray, we want to hasten to that prayer, right? To the Quran, to the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we want to hasten to it. The remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we want to hasten to it. Because in it is the remembrance of the one that we love, right? We want to try to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what I want to point to is that Musa alayhi salam, even even though he was meeting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you think about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, most likely any human being will be so focused on it that they're going to forget everything else. Is that right? Yes? But Musa alayhi salam didn't do that. He didn't forget about his responsibility. He didn't forget about his people. This is why he ordered Harun to do what? He said, "Khlufni fi qawmi," right? Take my place among my people. And so this shows that even though Musa alayhi salam was going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and obviously this is something that could be distracting, he was very كان عنده حرص, which means that he was very cautious, or he was very careful, right, to make sure that everything is set for his people, that they're taken care of. He understood his responsibility, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, right, Musa alayhi salam. And so this tells us that whatever is happening, we should always make sure that we take care of our responsibility. Right? Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and dedicating ourselves to Allah does not mean we forget our responsibilities. Right? It doesn't mean that. Because the Prophet ﷺ did the same thing. The Prophet ﷺ is like, he told his people, like, إِنِّي أَتْقَاكُمْ أَخْشَاكُمْ مِنَ اللَّهِ, that I have the most taqwa of you and fear of you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? I do. But I fast and I eat and I get married. He had a normal life. He had responsibilities, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he fulfilled those responsibilities. And that did not prevent him from having his time with worship to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And so this is the balance that we're talking about over here. Musa alayhi salam reflected that, right? That he made sure that his people had been taken care of, and he appointed the appropriate person to take care of the people, and gave him instructions, right? Instructions of what, of what he needs to do, right? He told him, "اخلفني في قومي وأصلح ولا تتبع سبيل المفسدين," right? Take my place and do what is right. وأصلح, right? Do what is right and do not follow the path of the al-mufsidin, the corrupters, the wrongdoers. And so this equally, it means that we also, when this gives you the key to kind of almost what is necessary, right? Is that any person who's put in a role, he has two main principles he needs to work by, right? Those are the two main principles, is to do what is best and not follow the path of the wrongdoers. It's as simple as that. If you think of any position that you hold, those will apply. No matter what your job is, whether it's a parent or a CEO or whatever it is, right? Whatever you're doing, those are the two main principles, right? Do right and don't follow the way of the corrupted, right? Or the wrongdoers. Don't fall to their scams. Don't let them drag you to what is wrong, right? Be honest and dutiful. And so these are the advice that Musa alayhi salam had given to his people, right? After, he left for 40 days, knowing that he'd be away for that long, and so he placed things in place to make sure that he fulfilled his responsibility. What time did we start today? Huh? Oh, you know how much time? Alhamdulillah. طيب. Sheikh Siraj. All right, khalas. We'll stop here today. We'll call it enough for tonight, inshallah. We will continue next week, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Yes. Bina. Yeah. Well, Musa alayhi salam understood his people. He understood his people. Because they had already, transgressed. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to bring this up next time, inshallah. What's interesting, if you look at Bani Israel, they all disbelieve, and they all believe. They all disbelieve, and they all believe, right? What regulates it? He knows his people, right? It's not like one or two or three. It's like they do it in masses, right? They all, do the wrong together, they all do the right together. It's an interesting phenomena, right? They have like a very unstable characteristics. So what is it that dictates that? And Musa alayhi salam knew this, right? And so this is why he instructed Harun about what to do. Wallah alam. We'll bring that up next time, inshallah. Any questions? Yes, Sheikh. I mentioned the what? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because that's the time where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted him to worship him. It indicates that this is the time or the best time where a person is closest to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The best of purification happens. Most of the people, they'll tell you that their salah at night in tahajjud is more impactful. They feel it more than when they pray in the morning. Right? Allah alam. Because Musa alayhi salam, during that day, obviously he needs to go out and find his food, his water. He's not going to do it at night. Right? So he's focusing at night, and during the day he needs to do whatever he needs for his livelihood. He's there for 40 days, Shaykh. Food will run out. Allah alam. Allah alam. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.